Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be presenting my young adult book presentation, and I'm going to be talking about the book that I chose, which is Everybody Looking by Candice Iloh. So some quick information about the author. Candice Iloh is a first-generation Nigerian-American writer, dancer, and author. They are also an educator, workshop facilitator, and slam poetry coach. So I found this quote on her bio. Throughout her work, Iloh has remained engaged with the communities they work and live in by mentoring young people creatively within public school classrooms, athletic programs, detention centers, and youth shelters. Some quick information about the publishers, as well as some awards and accolades that this book has received. So this book was a finalist for the National Book Award. It's a Michael L. Prince Award honoree and a Kirkus Review's Best Book. It was published by Dutton Books, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House LLC, New York, and it was published in 2020. So for the plot interview, I decided to summarize the plot in my own words. First, the main character, Ada, a first-generation Nigerian-American girl, is graduating high school and starting college at an HBCU. Leaving her traditional religious father and her drug-addicted mother behind, this story follows Ada's journey into a new environment where she must make her own choices for the first time and find her place while reckoning with her past. So this book is not exclusively what I would call a dance book. It's not about somebody who starts out strictly as a dancer and the story revolves only around dancing. It has a lot of other aspects to it, which I think makes it more interesting. So when I was trying to pick out a book for this, I really wanted to avoid picking fiction stories that were, about a ballet dancer who really wanted to be a professional dancer, and there's some conflict that stops her from doing that, but then she, fights through it, etc., blah, blah, blah. And I just think that's an overdone story, and there are too many books with the same exact tired story. So I really wanted to avoid that. And I also kind of wanted to avoid nonfiction in this case, because I think that also a lot of autobiographies, unfortunately, are about dancers, either like really accomplished ballerinas, or they're just about people who are, again, like extraordinarily accomplished in their field and have all this success being either a professional dancer or a professional choreographer. And although those books are great and they serve a wonderful purpose, I think that sometimes they miss the mark in terms of being relatable to young adults, especially students who are doing dance in public school. It's not always a relatable story when somebody is, choreographing for the New York City Ballet. So that's kind of one of the reasons I chose this book. Dance has always played a big part in Ada's life. From the moment she saw her first praise dance performance, she was enamored. The Yoruba and Igbo dance classes she took when she was little taught her about where she came from. However, Ada's father sees dance largely as a distraction from her career path. He wants her to be an accountant, which is what she starts out studying in college. As she discovers the dance community at her college, she begins to question her life path and learns more about herself. So this is one of my favorite quotes from the book. "You, who are you dancing for?" He slows pace, stopping right in front of me. "I'm talking to you, sis. Who are you dancing for?" He pushes, repeating the question, waiting for me to answer. This stupid stuttering thing I do whenever I'm nervous or know I'm not being honest takes over my mouth when all I want to do is lift my chin up, look him in the eye, and say, "Me." So why this book? So I think one of the things that this book does really well is show the high school to college transition. It perfectly illustrates the anxieties and difficulties that many students encounter during the transition from high school to college. And I think schools do a wonderful job of preparing their students for that transition academically, but where they miss the mark often is preparing them for that transition socially and emotionally. And I think that this book does a wonderful job of showing, how difficult it can be, and it's not just this like, fantasy telling of like, oh, I went to college and I discovered myself and everything was great. It shows how, you can be really homesick, you can grapple with things from your past, you can be lost and not know who you are. And I think that's a really important story for especially 12th graders who are about to go through that transition. I think it's an important story to read. Additionally, it's also a story about a girl going to an HBCU, which I think is not a super represented story in a lot of books. And so I also think that's important for students to read. Secondly, I really enjoyed the diverse characters and ideas presented throughout this book. As I said before, I struggled to find fiction YA dance novels that aren't just about ballet dancers, that like cookie cutter story about, how they struggle to make it as a professional dancer and then there's some conflict. Um, Unlike that, this story includes diverse dancers and dances. So it's not just exclusively her like dancing in a studio, it also shows, the cultural dances that she learned when she was little. It shows dance as praise within a church environment. So it's not just this one-dimensional view of dance that's presented. It's very diverse. It also explores themes such as sexuality, addiction, religion, and bullying that many students across the U.S. will identify with. And lastly, dancing for self. In this story, Ada learns to dance unapologetically for herself. Dance isn't presented as exclusive and mastery driven in this book. It's seen as a tool for self-transformation and discovery. Like I was saying earlier, in terms of relatability, I think a lot of students don't see a lot of themselves represented in dance books and dance media in general. A lot of it centers around mastery and physical rigor and training, all for this professional career. And I think that dance isn't just about that. You can be a dancer and not be paid to do it. Just because you're not on Broadway doesn't mean that you're not a dancer. And I think those kinds of stories where dance is presented as this tool for becoming who you are and learning more about yourself, those are the stories that are more relatable to our students. So connecting this book to curriculum. These quotations that are included right here are taken straight from the Blueprint for Dance education from the New York DOE website. So if you want to learn more about those curricular targets, you can visit that blueprint. So number 1, analyze, critique, and communicate about dance. This book provides great literacy examples of how students can describe movement through words. So not only is this story super intriguing, the author does a wonderful job of describing movement and bodies with such colorful and creative language. And I think it's a great literacy example of how students can do this themselves. And hopefully I would want to see my students take some of the language that the author uses to then use it when they're talking about dance and movement. So secondly, understand dance as a means of expression and communication. Ada's story is a great starting point for student discussions about the significance of different dance styles. Like I've said, this story shows dance in a lot of different ways. It's not just this thing that's done in the studio. It's done in a religious context. It's done in a cultural context. And I think learning about these different contexts of dance and how they exist in different aspects of our life is a very important discussion to have in a classroom. Why is dance not just something that exists in a studio? Why do people do it as part of their religion? Why do people do it as part of their traditions and culture? Those discussions are very key and a required part of the dance curriculum in New York. And lastly, connect dance to health and well-being. Students will be able to witness Ada's mental health transformation when she chooses to make dance a central part of her life. So one of the most beautiful things about this book is how the character develops as dance kind of draws her in and becomes a more central part of her life. And in the end, she kind of makes that decision to prioritize it. And just watching her mental health in other aspects of her life improve as she makes this decision is really beautiful, and I think something that a lot of students will be able to relate to. So that's kind of it in terms of why I think this book is important to include in a dance curriculum, but just a couple of things to note before making that decision. So, number one, there is some explicit language within the book. I don't think that it takes away from the story at all. It's just something to note. Secondly, which I think is the most important thing, there are some mature themes presented throughout this book, such as sexual abuse and addiction. And so I think, again, I don't think that's reason to not include this in a curriculum. I think it's just something that requires a little bit of discussion before diving into the book. And lastly, there is a lot of discussion about religion in the book, and some of that discussion revolves around questioning religion. And again, I don't think this is a reason not to include it in a curriculum. It's just something that unfortunately teachers need to be aware of nowadays with all of these book bans, etc. It's something that I think you would have to probably, I mean, again, I'm not a public school teacher yet, so I don't know the rules and specifics about like what you can and can't include in a curriculum, but I think it's just an issue of knowing your audience, knowing your administration, knowing your students before making that decision about this book. But with all that being said, this is a wonderful book. I really hope that you give it a read, and I hope that it gets included in more curriculums down the road. So thank you so much for listening. Have a good one.